The last piece of chocolate cake disappeared into my mouth at exactly 11:43 p.m. on April 30th. I savored that final bite with an almost ceremonial attention, not just because it was delicious, but because I knew it represented the end of a relationship that had defined much of my life. The next morning would mark the beginning of my 30-day experiment without added sugar, an undertaking I approached with equal parts curiosity, determination, and if I'm being honest, significant apprehension. This wasn't my first attempt at modifying my diet. Like many Americans, I'd cycled through various nutritional approaches over the years, periods of calorie restriction, brief enthusiasms for particular superfoods, and the occasional weekend cleanse. But this experiment felt fundamentally different because it wasn't primarily about weight loss or following a trendy eating plan. It was about understanding the psychological and physiological relationship I had developed with perhaps the most pervasive yet misunderstood substance in our food supply: added sugar. The catalyst for this experiment wasn't a health scare or a doctor's recommendation. Rather, it was a growing sense of cognitive dissonance I could no longer ignore. As someone who generally prioritized health, exercising regularly, choosing organic produce when possible, limiting processed foods, I'd nevertheless maintained a curious blind spot around my sugar consumption. I found myself making elaborate justifications for my daily chocolate indulgences or the necessary afternoon cookie that got me through the workday energy slump. I was, in effect, behaving exactly like someone with a dependency, complete with rationalization, ritual usage, and an unwillingness to honestly assess my consumption patterns. What finally pushed me toward this experiment was the disconnect between my self-image as a health-conscious person and the reality of my eating habits. The moment of truth came during a routine pantry organization, when I realized that I had unconsciously established hidden sugar caches throughout my home, chocolate squares in my desk drawer, cookie packages behind the pasta boxes, emergency candy in my car's glove compartment. This wasn't the behavior of someone making free and conscious choices. It was the behavior of someone who had developed elaborate systems to maintain a steady supply of a substance they couldn't comfortably imagine living without. Before I describe what happened during those 30 days, it's important to clarify what this experiment actually entailed. I wasn't eliminating natural sugars found in whole fruits or vegetables. The fructose in an apple comes packaged with fiber, water, and numerous micronutrients that affect how your body processes it. Instead, I was eliminating added sugars in all their myriad forms, obvious ones like table sugar, honey, and maple syrup, but also the dozens of less recognizable names that appear on ingredient lists: dextrose, maltose, rice syrup, concentrated fruit juice, and the particularly ubiquitous high fructose corn syrup. The magnitude of this challenge became apparent during my pre-experiment pantry audit. I discovered added sugars lurking in products I had never thought to question. The organic tomato sauce I'd been purchasing for years, 11 grams per serving. The healthy granola I ate each morning, 17 grams per cup. The almond milk in my coffee, 7 grams per cup. And perhaps most surprisingly, the reduced sugar salad dressing I had specifically chosen because it seemed like a virtuous option, 5 grams per tablespoon. This audit revealed that even as someone who thought I maintained a pretty healthy diet, I had been consuming somewhere between 87 and 112 grams of added sugar daily, the equivalent of about 28 teaspoons. For context, the American Heart Association recommends no more than 6 teaspoons, 25 grams for women, and 9 teaspoons, 36 grams, for men. I was consuming in a single day what would be considered a reasonable amount for 3 to 4 days. The decision to document this 30-day journey wasn't made lightly. The internet certainly doesn't need another before and after transformation story with carefully staged lighting and dramatic claims. But I believe there was value in honestly recording the day-to-day reality of removing a substance so deeply integrated into both our food system and our emotional lives. I committed to daily journaling, weekly measurements of basic health markers, and a careful log of both physical and psychological observations. The first 72 hours without added sugar were, to put it mildly, illuminating. I'd anticipated some adjustment difficulties, but I wasn't prepared for the intensity of both physical and psychological responses that emerged once my body recognized that its regular sugar supply had been interrupted. The initial physical symptoms appeared about 18 hours after my last sugar consumption. What began as a mild headache behind my eyes progressively intensified into what felt like a persistent, throbbing pressure throughout my skull. By the 36-hour mark, I had developed noticeable fatigue, muscle aches reminiscent of the early stages of the flu, and a mental fogginess that made focusing on work nearly impossible. Most surprising was a distinct trembling in my hands that became apparent whenever I tried to type or hold a glass, a physical manifestation of what was clearly a significant neurochemical adjustment underway in my body. These physical symptoms were challenging, but the psychological dimensions of those first 72 hours proved even more revealing. Around the 24-hour mark, I experienced what I can only describe as compelling intrusive thoughts about specific sugary foods. These weren't vague cravings, but vivid, almost cinematic mental images of particular items. The chocolate almond croissants from the bakery near my office, the precisely layered tiramisu from my favorite Italian restaurant, the peanut butter cups I kept in my freezer for emergencies. These thoughts arrived unprompted, interrupting whatever I was doing with an intensity that demanded attention. Even more striking was the emotional volatility that emerged. I found myself experiencing disproportionate irritability over minor inconveniences, followed by periods of distinct dysphoria. Not quite sadness, but a heavy, pleasureless state that made everything seem slightly more difficult and considerably less rewarding. By the 48-hour mark, I noticed an uncharacteristic tendency toward catastrophic thinking, where small work challenges suddenly seemed insurmountable, and typical life stressors expanded into worst-case scenarios in my mind. These observations might sound dramatic, but they're supported by a substantial body of research. Dr. Nicole Avena, a neuroscientist at Mount Sinai School of Medicine who studies sugar's effects on the brain, has documented how sugar consumption triggers the release of dopamine, the same neurotransmitter activated by certain drugs of abuse, in brain regions associated with reward processing. Her research, published in the journal Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews, demonstrates how repeated sugar consumption can lead to changes in both the brain's reward pathways and stress response systems, creating a neurochemical pattern that shares certain characteristics with substance dependencies. Similar findings have emerged from research at Yale University's Department of Psychiatry, where functional MRI studies have shown that merely showing images of milkshakes to people with higher scores on food addiction scales activates the same reward and motivation centers that light up in people with substance dependencies when they're exposed to drug-related cues. The parallels don't end with neural activation patterns. The physiological and psychological symptoms I experienced during those first 72 hours, headaches, tremors, fatigue, intrusive thoughts, emotional volatility, mirror what researchers term withdrawal symptoms in other contexts. I'm not suggesting that sugar addiction is identical to dependencies on alcohol or drugs. The mechanisms, severity, and consequences differ in important ways, but I am saying that my experience during those first 72 hours forced me to recognize that my relationship with sugar had neurobiological dimensions I had never fully acknowledged. Dimensions that explained why previous attempts to merely cut back had inevitably failed after a few days of white-knuckled resistance. By the fourth day, something unexpected happened. I woke up without the headache that had been my constant companion. The mental fog began to lift. The trembling in my hands subsided. While I still experienced intermittent cravings, they had lost the intrusive, almost desperate quality of those first days. I wasn't yet feeling great, but I was clearly moving through some kind of inflection point in the process. This matched the timeline suggested by research from the Department of Nutritional Sciences at the University of California, which indicates that many of the acute manifestations of removing added sugar begin to normalize around days 4 or 5, as the body adjusts to new neurochemical and metabolic baselines. The changes that began to emerge in the second week were subtle at first, then increasingly pronounced. The most immediate shift occurred in my sleep patterns. As someone who had struggled with insomnia for years, taking at least 30-40 minutes to fall asleep and waking several times during the night, I was unprepared for the profound change in my sleep quality. By day 10, I was falling asleep within minutes of lying down and sleeping through the night without interruption. The sleep tracking app I'd been using for months showed a 38% increase in deep sleep and a 26% increase in REM sleep compared to my baseline measurements. This improvement in sleep quality had cascading effects on multiple dimensions of my daily experience. The mid-afternoon energy crash that I had previously attributed to my natural circadian rhythm and addressed with sugar-laden snacks simply disappeared. Instead of experiencing dramatic energy fluctuations throughout the day, I maintained a steady, sustained alertness from morning until early evening. The brain fog that had been a familiar feature of my mental landscape, particularly during complex work tasks requiring sustained attention, gave way to a clarity and focus I hadn't experienced since college. Particularly revealing was how my relationship with hunger transformed. Prior to this experiment, hunger had always arrived as a somewhat urgent, almost anxious sensation that demanded immediate attention. By the middle of the second week, I noticed hunger presenting differently, as a clear physical signal but without the accompanying anxiety or urgency. I could acknowledge I was hungry without feeling compelled to address it immediately, a change that researchers at the University of California, San Francisco attribute to stabilized blood glucose levels and improved leptin sensitivity. Leptin being a hormone that regulates hunger signals. The psychological dimensions of this transformation proved equally significant. By day 14, I noticed a marked reduction in anxiety levels. As someone who had lived with a low-grade background hum of anxious thinking for most of my adult life, and occasionally managed it with comfort foods, I was surprised to experience extended periods completely free from anxious rumination. This observation aligns with research published in the journal Medical Hypotheses, which documents the bidirectional relationship between blood sugar dysregulation and anxiety symptoms, suggesting that stabilizing glucose levels can significantly impact mood regulation systems. Even more interesting was how my emotional resilience improved. Minor stressors that would have previously derailed my mood for hours, a critical email, a traffic delay, a small argument, no longer carried the same emotional impact. I recovered more quickly and maintained perspective more easily. This change became particularly evident during a work crisis in the middle of week 2, when a major project nearly collapsed due to a client's last-minute demands. Rather than spiraling into catastrophic thinking, my previous pattern, I found myself calmly assessing options and implementing solutions without the emotional overwhelm that would have typically accompanied such a situation. Not all the changes were immediately positive. I experienced several days of noticeable digestive adjustment as my gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria that inhabit our digestive tract and influence everything from immune function to neurotransmitter production, adapted to the absence of its regular sugar supply. Research from the Department of Microbiology at University College London has shown that dietary changes can alter gut bacterial composition within 48 to 72 hours, potentially creating temporary digestive discomfort as certain bacterial populations decline and others flourish in response to new nutritional inputs. By the third week, the physical changes became apparent even to others. The persistent puffiness around my face that I had attributed to just how I look had noticeably diminished. The inflammatory acne that had been a stubborn presence along my jawline for years showed significant improvement. These changes reflect what dermatologists at the Perelman School of Medicine have documented regarding the relationship between blood sugar fluctuations, insulin levels, and both inflammatory skin conditions and fluid retention patterns. Perhaps the most unexpected third-week development concerned my taste perception. Foods I had previously found unremarkable, like fresh berries, roasted sweet potatoes, or even certain vegetables, suddenly possessed a complexity and sweetness I had never detected before. A perfectly ripe strawberry tasted almost candy-like. A roasted carrot had a caramelized sweetness that seemed almost dessert-like. This sensory recalibration is well documented in research from the Neurochemical Senses Center, which has shown that reducing dietary sugar can reset taste receptors' sensitivity threshold within 10 to 14 days, allowing detection of subtler natural sweetness that had previously been overwhelmed. I want to speak directly to you watching this video right now. Have you noticed how many of our cultural rituals and emotional coping mechanisms are built around sugar consumption? How celebrations inevitably feature cake, how bad days are soothed with ice cream, how holidays are defined by their associated treats? This experiment forced me to confront how thoroughly sugar had become integrated not just in my diet, but in my entire emotional regulation system and social patterns. The most challenging moments weren't about physical cravings, but navigating these deeply ingrained emotional and cultural associations. If you're finding value in understanding these effects of removing sugar, consider subscribing to this channel. Unlike typical diet content focused on quick transformations or before and after aesthetics, we explore the complex physiological and psychological dimensions of our relationship with food. The comment section below is open for your experiences. Have you noticed mood or energy changes when modifying your sugar intake? Your observations might help others connect these important dots in their own health journey. The fourth week brought what was perhaps the most meaningful change, a fundamental shift in my relationship with food overall. After nearly a month without added sugar, I found myself naturally drawn to foods that supported sustained energy rather than momentary pleasure. This wasn't about willpower or discipline. Those approaches had failed me countless times before. Rather, it reflected a recalibration of my body's own regulatory systems and a growing awareness of how different foods affected my physical and mental state. Most surprisingly, I found myself spontaneously intermittent fasting, not as a planned dietary strategy, but simply because I wasn't experiencing the urgent hunger that had previously driven me to eat immediately upon waking. I typically wasn't hungry until around 11 a.m., naturally creating a 16-hour fasting window overnight. Research from the Salk Institute suggests that such spontaneous changes in eating patterns often emerge when blood glucose and insulin levels stabilize, allowing the body's natural hunger regulation to function more effectively. By day 28, I had lost 8.7 pounds, without any intentional calorie restriction or increased exercise. More significantly, my body composition had shifted. The stubborn midsection fat that had resisted previous weight loss attempts showed measurable reduction, with a 1.5-inch decrease in waist circumference. This pattern aligns with research from the Journal of the American Medical Association, showing that reducing added sugar intake specifically targets visceral fat, the metabolically active fat surrounding organs that is particularly associated with inflammation and metabolic dysfunction. Beyond these measurable changes, I experienced a more subjective but equally important shift in my cognitive patterns. Mental tasks that had previously required significant effort, maintaining focused attention during long meetings, processing complex information, working through multi-step problems, now came with relative ease. More notably, the brain fog that had often descended in the late afternoon entirely disappeared. This cognitive enhancement reflects findings from UCLA's Department of Neurosurgery, which has documented how blood glucose fluctuations directly impact cognitive function, with particular effects on attention, information processing speed, and executive function. The final days of the experiment brought an important moment of truth. After 30 days without added sugar, I decided to intentionally reintroduce a modest amount, in this case, a small piece of dark chocolate that I would have previously consumed without a second thought. The experience was revelatory. Within 20 minutes of eating it, I noticed a distinct shift in my mental state, a brief surge of energy followed by a foggy heaviness that affected my concentration for hours afterward. That night, my previously improved sleep was disrupted, and I woke feeling distinctly less rested despite spending the same amount of time in bed. This controlled reintroduction provided the most compelling evidence of sugar's effects on my system. When consumed regularly, these effects had been my constant baseline, impossible to perceive because they had no contrast. Only by completely removing added sugar for an extended period could I clearly discern its impact when reintroduced. This observation parallels findings from research at the University of Zurich, which demonstrates how eliminating specific food components and then systematically reintroducing them can reveal individualized response patterns that remain imperceptible during regular consumption. As the experiment officially concluded, I faced the question that follows any successful dietary modification. What now? Would I return to my previous patterns, maintain the complete elimination of added sugar, or find some middle path? The answer emerged not from intellectual deliberation, but from the embodied wisdom gained through the experience itself. Having directly perceived how dramatically better I felt without added sugar, and how distinctly its reintroduction affected me, the decision-making calculus fundamentally changed. I didn't adopt a zero-tolerance approach moving forward. Instead, I developed what nutritional psychologists call conscious choice capacity. The ability to make decisions about consumption with full awareness of the likely consequences, rather than from habit or compulsion. In practical terms, this meant that occasionally, in specific circumstances that felt genuinely worth the trade-off, a celebratory dinner, a special homemade dessert, I might choose to consume something containing added sugar, but with full consciousness of its likely effects, rather than the mindless consumption that had previously characterized my relationship with these foods. The most enduring outcome of this 30-day experiment wasn't the physical changes, significant though they were. It was the relationship change, moving from a largely unconscious, habit-driven pattern of consumption to one characterized by awareness, choice, and a clear perception of consequences. This shift aligns with what researchers in the field of mindful eating term conscious eating competence, the ability to make food choices from a place of bodily awareness and integrated knowledge, rather than from external rules, emotional triggers, or unconscious habits.